I remembered some things I had conveniently ignored over the years. Ethan Allen spent several months in fetid and cramped British prison ships, much of the time locked into 30 pounds of iron shackles, and then more time in an English dungeon. He was a prisoner of war, captured at the 1775 Battle of Montreal, while fighting for the same sorts of freedom Jaime Roldos and Omar Torrijos now sought for their people. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and all the other founding fathers had risked their lives for similar ideals. Winning the Revolution was no foregone conclusion. They understood that if they lost, they would be hanged as traitors. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, and Lewis and Clark also had endured great hardships and made many sacrifices. And Drake and Morgan? I was a bit hazy about that period in history, but I remembered that Protestant England had seen itself sorely threatened by Catholic Spain. I had to admit to the possibility that Drake and Morgan had turned to piracy in order to strike at the heart of the Spanish Empire, at those gold ships, to defend the sanctity of England, rather than out of a desire for self-aggrandizement. As we sailed up that channel, tacking back and forth into the wind, inching closer to the mountains rising from the sea, Great Thatch Island to the north and St. John to the south, I could not erase these thoughts from my mind. Mary handed me a beer and turned up the volume on a Jimmy Buffett song. Yet, despite the beauty that surrounded me and the sense of freedom that sailing usually brings, I felt angry. I tried to brush it off. I chugged down the beer. The emotion would not leave. I was angered by those voices from history and the way I had used them to rationalize my own greed. I was furious at my parents, and at Tilton, that self-righteous prep school on the hill, for imposing all that history on me. I popped open another beer. I could have killed Mac Hall for what he had done to Bruno. A wooden boat with a rainbow flag sailed past us, its sails billowing out on both sides, downwinding through the channel. A half-dozen young men and women shouted and waved at us, hippies in brightly colored sarongs, one couple stark naked on the foredeck. It was obvious from the boat itself and the look about them that they lived aboard, a communal society, modern pirates, free, uninhibited. I tried to wave back, but my hand would not obey. I felt overcome with jealousy. Mary stood on the deck, watching them as they faded into the distance at our stern. "How would you like that life?" she asked. And then I understood. It was not about my parents, Tilton, or Mac Hall. It was my life I hated. Mine. The person responsible, the one I loathed, was me. Mary shouted something. She was pointing over the starboard bow. She stepped closer to me. "Leinster Bay," she said. "Tonight's anchorage." There it was, nestled into St. John's Island, a cove where pirate ships had lain in wait for the gold fleet when it passed through this very body of water. I sailed in closer, then handed the tiller over to Mary and headed up to the foredeck. As she navigated the boat around Watermelon Key and into the beautiful bay, I lowered and bagged the jib and hauled the anchor out of its locker. She deftly dropped the mainsail. I nudged the anchor over the side. The chain rattled down into the crystal-clear water, and the boat drifted to a stop. After we settled in, Mary took a swim and a nap. I left her a note and rowed the dinghy ashore, beaching it just below the ruins of an old sugar plantation. I sat there next to the water for a long time, trying not to think, concentrating on emptying myself of all emotion. But it did not work. Late in the afternoon, I struggled up the steep hill and found myself standing on the crumbling walls of this ancient plantation, looking down at our anchored sloop. I watched the sun sink toward the Caribbean. It all seemed very idyllic, yet I knew that the plantation surrounding me had been the scene of untold misery. Hundreds of African slaves had died here, forced at gunpoint to build the stately mansion, to plant and harvest the cane, and to operate the equipment that turned raw sugar into the basic ingredient of rum. The tranquility of the place masked its history of brutality, even as it masked the rage that surged within me. The sun disappeared behind a mountain-ridged island. A vast magenta arch spread across the sky. The sea began to darken, and I came face to face with the shocking fact that I, too, had been a slaver, that my job at Maine had not been just about using debt to draw poor countries into the global empire. My inflated forecasts were not merely vehicles for assuring that when my country needed oil, we could call in our pound of flesh. And my position as a partner was not simply about enhancing the firm's profitability. My job was also about people and their families, people akin to the ones who had died to construct the wall I sat on, people I had exploited. For 10 years, I had been the heir of those slavers who had marched into African jungles and hauled men and women off to waiting ships. Mine had been a more modern approach, subtler. I never had to see the dying bodies, smell the rotting flesh, or hear the screams of agony. But what I had done was every bit as sinister, and because I could remove myself from it, because I could cut myself off from the personal aspects, the bodies, the flesh, and the screams, perhaps in the final analysis, I was the greater sinner. I glanced again at the sloop where it rode at anchor, straining against the outflowing tide. Mary was lounging on the deck, probably drinking a margarita and waiting to hand one to me. In that moment, seeing her there in that last light of the day, so relaxed, so trusting, I was struck by what I was doing to her and to all the others who worked for me, the ways I was turning them into EHMs. I was doing to them what Claudine had done to me, but without Claudine's honesty. I was seducing them through raises and promotions to be slavers, and yet they, like me, were also being shackled to the system. They, too, were enslaved. I turned away from the sea and the bay and the magenta sky. I closed my eyes to the walls that had been built by slaves torn from their African homes. I tried to shut it all out. When I opened my eyes, I was staring at a large, gnarled stick, as thick as a baseball bat and twice as long. I leaped up, grabbed the stick, and began slamming it against the stone walls. I beat on those walls until I collapsed from exhaustion. I lay in the grass after that, watching the clouds drift over me. Eventually, I made my way back down to the dinghy. I stood there on the beach, looking out at our sailboat anchored in the azure waters, and I knew what I had to do. I knew that if I ever went back to my former life, to Maine and all it represented, I would be lost forever. The raises, the pensions, the insurance and perks, the equity. The longer I stayed, the more difficult it was to get out. I had become a slave. I could continue to beat myself up as I had beat on those stone walls, or I could escape. 2 days later, I returned to Boston. On April 1st, 1980, I walked into Paul Pretty's office and resigned. Part 4, 1981 to present. Chapter 26, Ecuador's Presidential Death. Leaving Maine was no easy matter. Paul Pretty refused to believe me. April Fools, he winked. I assured him that I was serious, recalling Paula's advice that I should do nothing to antagonize anyone, or to give cause for suspicion that I might expose my EHM work. I emphasized that I appreciated everything Maine had done for me, but that I needed to move on. I had always wanted to write about the people that Maine had introduced me to around the world, but nothing political. I said I wanted to freelance for National Geographic and other magazines, and to continue to travel. I declared my loyalty to Maine, and swore that I would sing its praises at every opportunity. Finally, Paul gave in. After that, everyone else tried to talk me out of resigning. I was reminded frequently about how good I had it, and I was even accused of insanity. I came to understand that no one wanted to accept the fact that I was leaving voluntarily, at least in part because it forced them to look at themselves. If I were not crazy for leaving, then they might have to consider their own sanity in staying. It was easier to see me as a person who had departed from his senses. Particularly disturbing were the reactions of my staff. In their eyes, I was deserting them, and there was no strong heir apparent. However, I had made up my mind. After all those years of vacillation, I now was determined to make a clean sweep. Unfortunately, it did not quite work out that way. True, I no longer had a job, but since I had been far from a fully vested partner, the cash-out of my stock was not sufficient for retirement. Had I stayed at Maine another few years, I might have become the 40-year-old millionaire I had once envisioned. However, at 35, I had a long way to go to accomplish that objective. It was a cold and dreary April in Boston. Then one day Paul Priddy called and pleaded with me to come to his office. "One of our clients is threatening to drop us," he said. "They hired us because they wanted you to represent them on the expert witness stand." I thought a lot about it. By the time I sat across the desk from Paul, I had made my decision. I named my price, a retainer that was more than 3 times what my main salary had been. To my surprise, he agreed, and that started me on a new career. For the next several years, I was employed as a highly paid expert witness, primarily for U.S. electric utility companies seeking to have new power plants approved for construction by Public Utilities Commissions. One of my clients was the Public Service Company of New Hampshire. My job was to justify, under oath, the economic feasibility of the highly controversial Seabrook nuclear power plant. Although I was no longer directly involved with Latin America, I continued to follow events there. As an expert witness, I had lots of time between appearances on the stand. I kept in touch with Paula and renewed old friendships from my Peace Corps days in Ecuador, a country that had suddenly jumped to center stage in the world of international oil politics. Jaime Roldos was moving forward. He took his campaign promises seriously, and he was launching an all-out attack on the oil companies. He seemed to see clearly the things that many others on both sides of the Panama Canal either missed or chose to ignore. He understood the underlying currents that threatened to turn the world into a global empire and to relegate the citizens of his country to a very minor role, bordering on servitude. As I read the newspaper articles about him, I was impressed not only by his commitment, but also by his ability to perceive the deeper issues. And the deeper issues pointed to the fact that we were entering a new epoch of world politics. In November 1980, Carter lost the U.S. presidential election to Ronald Reagan. The Panama Canal Treaty he had negotiated with Torrijos and the situation in Iran, especially the hostages held at the U.S. Embassy and the failed rescue attempt, were major factors. However, something subtler was also happening. A president whose greatest goal was world peace, and who was dedicated to reducing U.S. dependence on oil, was replaced by a man who believed that the United States' rightful place was at the top of a world pyramid held up by military muscle, and that controlling oil fields, wherever they existed, was part of our manifest destiny. A president who installed solar panels on White House roofs was replaced by one who, immediately upon occupying the Oval Office, had them removed. Carter may have been an ineffective politician, but he had a vision for America that was consistent with the one defined in our Declaration of Independence. In retrospect, he now seems naively archaic, a throwback to the ideals that molded this nation and drew so many of our grandparents to her shores. When we compare him to his immediate predecessors and successors, he is an anomaly. His worldview was inconsistent with that of the EHM's. Reagan, on the other hand, was most definitely a global empire builder, a servant of the corporatocracy. At the time of his election, I found it fitting that he was a Hollywood actor, a man who had followed orders passed down from moguls, who knew how to take direction. That would be his signature. He would cater to the men who shuttled back and forth from corporate CEO offices to bank boards and into the halls of government. He would serve the men who appeared to serve him, but who in fact ran the government. Men like Vice President George H.W. Bush, Secretary of State George Shultz, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, Richard Cheney, Richard Helms, and Robert McNamara. He would advocate what those men wanted, an America that controlled the world and all its resources, a world that answered to the commands of that America, a U.S. military that would enforce the rules as they were written by America, and an international trade and banking system that supported America as CEO of the global empire. As I looked into the future, it seemed we were entering a period that would be very good to the EHMs. It was another twist of fate that I had chosen this moment in history to drop out. The more I reflected on it, however, the better I felt about it. I knew that my timing was right. As for what this meant in the long term, I had no crystal ball. However, I knew from history that empires do not endure, and that the pendulum always swings in both directions. From my perspective, men like Roldos offered hope. I was certain that Ecuador's new president understood many of the subtleties of the current situation. I knew that he had been a Torrijos admirer, and had applauded Carter for his courageous stand on the Panama Canal issue. I felt certain that Roldos would not falter. I could only hope that his fortitude would light a candle for the leaders of other countries, who needed the type of inspiration he and Torrijos could provide. Early in 1981, the Roldos administration formally presented his new hydrocarbons law to the Ecuadorian Congress. If implemented, it would reform the country's relationship to oil companies. By many standards, it was considered revolutionary and even radical. It certainly aimed to change the way business was conducted. Its influence would stretch far beyond Ecuador into much of Latin America and throughout the world. The oil companies reacted predictably. They pulled out all the stops. Their public relations people went to work to vilify Jaime Roldos, and their lobbyists swept into Quito and Washington, briefcases full of threats and payoffs. They tried to paint the first democratically elected president of Ecuador in modern times as another Castro. But Roldos would not cave in to intimidation. He responded by denouncing the conspiracy between politics and oil, and religion. He openly accused the Summer Institute of Linguistics of colluding with the oil companies, and then, in an extremely bold, perhaps reckless move, he ordered SIL out of the country. Only weeks after sending his legislative package to Congress, and a couple of days after expelling the SIL missionaries, Roldos warned all foreign interests, including but not limited to oil companies, that unless they implemented plans that would help Ecuador's people, they would be forced to leave his country. He delivered a major speech at the Atahualpa Olympic Stadium in Quito, and then headed off to a small community in southern Ecuador. He died there in a fiery helicopter crash on May 24, 1981. The world was shocked. Latin Americans were outraged. Newspapers throughout the hemisphere blazed, CIA assassination. In addition to the fact that Washington and the oil companies hated him, many circumstances appeared to support these allegations, and such suspicions were heightened as more facts became known. Nothing was ever proven, but eyewitnesses claimed that Roldos, forewarned about an attempt on his life, had taken precautions, including traveling in 2 helicopters. At the last moment, one of his security officers had convinced him to board the decoy copter. It had blown up. Despite world reaction, the news hardly made the U.S. press. Osvaldo Hurtado took over as Ecuador's president. He reinstated the Summer Institute of Linguistics and their oil company sponsors. By the end of the year, he had launched an ambitious program to increase oil drilling by Texaco and other foreign companies in the Gulf of Guayaquil and the Amazon basin. Omar Torrijos, in eulogizing Roldós, referred to him as brother. He also confessed to having nightmares about his own assassination. He saw himself dropping from the sky in a gigantic fireball. It was prophetic. Chapter 27. Panama, Another Presidential Death. I was stunned by Roldós's death, but perhaps I should not have been. I was anything but naive. I knew about Arbenz, Mossadegh, Allende, and about many other people whose names never made the newspapers or history books, but whose lives were destroyed and sometimes cut short because they stood up to the corporatocracy. Nevertheless, I was shocked. It was just so very blatant. I had concluded, after our phenomenal success in Saudi Arabia, that such wantonly overt actions were things of the past. I thought the jackals had been relegated to zoos. Now I saw that I was wrong. I had no doubt that Roldós's death had not been an accident. It had all the markings of a CIA-orchestrated assassination. I understood that it had been executed so blatantly in order to send a message. The new Reagan administration, complete with its fast-draw Hollywood cowboy image, was the ideal vehicle for delivering such a message. The jackals were back, and they wanted Omar Torrijos and everyone else who might consider joining an anti-corporatocracy crusade to know it. But Torrijos was not buckling. Like Roldós, he refused to be intimidated. He, too, expelled the Summer Institute of Linguistics, and he adamantly refused to give in to the Reagan administration's demands to renegotiate the Canal Treaty. 2 months after Roldós's death, Omar Torrijos's nightmare came true. He died in a plane crash. It was July 31st, 1981. Latin America and the world reeled. Torrijos was known across the globe. He was respected as the man who had forced the United States to relinquish the Panama Canal to its rightful owners, and who continued to stand up to Ronald Reagan. He was a champion of human rights, the head of state who had opened his arms to refugees across the political spectrum, including the Shah of Iran. A charismatic voice for social justice, who, many believed, would be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now he was dead. CIA assassination once again headlined articles and editorials. Graham Greene began his book, Getting to Know the General, the one that grew out of the trip when I met him at the Hotel Panama, with the following paragraph. In August 1981, my bag was packed for my 5th visit to Panama, when the news came to me over the telephone of the death of General Omar Torrijos Herrera, my friend and host. The small plane in which he was flying to a house which he owned at Coclecito in the mountains of Panama had crashed, and there were no survivors. A few days later, the voice of his security guard, Sergeant Chuchu, alias José de Jesus Martinez, ex-professor of Marxist philosophy at Panama University, professor of mathematics and a poet, told me, "There was a bomb in that plane. I know there was a bomb in that plane, but I can't tell you why over the telephone." People everywhere mourned the death of this man, who had earned a reputation as defender of the poor and defenseless, and they clamored for Washington to open investigations into CIA activities. However, this was not about to happen. There were men who hated Torrijos, and the list included people with immense power. Before his death, he was openly loathed by President Reagan, Vice President Bush, Secretary of Defense Weinberger, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as by the CEOs of many powerful corporations. The military chiefs were especially incensed by provisions in the Torrijos-Carter Treaty that forced them to close the School of the Americas and the U.S. Southern Command's Tropical Warfare Center. The chiefs thus had a serious problem. Either they had to figure out some way to get around the new treaty, or they needed to find another country that would be willing to harbor these facilities, an unlikely prospect in the closing decades of the 20th century. Of course, there was also another option: dispose of Torrijos and renegotiate the treaty with his successor. Among Torrijos' corporate enemies were the huge multinationals. Most had close ties to U.S. politicians and were involved in exploiting Latin American labor forces and natural resources: oil, lumber, tin, copper, bauxite, and agricultural lands. They included manufacturing firms, communications companies, shipping and transportation conglomerates, and engineering and other technologically oriented corporations. The Bechtel Group Incorporated was a prime example of the cozy relationship between private companies and the U.S. government. I knew Bechtel well. We at Maine often worked closely with the company, and its chief architect became a close personal friend. Bechtel was the United States' most influential engineering and construction company. Its president and senior officers included George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, who despised Torrijos because he brazenly courted a Japanese plan to replace Panama's existing canal with a new, more efficient one. Such a move not only would transfer ownership from the United States to Panama, but also would exclude Bechtel from participating in the most exciting and potentially lucrative engineering project of the century. Torrijos stood up to these men, and he did so with grace, charm, and a wonderful sense of humor. Now he was dead, and he had been replaced by a protege, Manuel Noriega, a man who lacked Torrijos' wit, charisma, and intelligence, and a man who many suspected had no chance against the Reagans, Bushes, and Bechtels of the world. I was personally devastated by the tragedy. I spent many hours reflecting on my conversations with Torrijos. Late one night, I sat for a long time staring at his photo in a magazine, and recalling my first night in Panama, riding in a cab through the rain, stopping before his gigantic billboard picture. Omar's ideal is freedom. The missile is not invented that can kill an ideal. The memory of that inscription sent a shudder through me, even as it had on that stormy night. I could not have known back then that Torrijos would collaborate with Carter to return the Panama Canal to the people who rightfully deserved to own it, or that this victory, along with his attempts to reconcile differences between Latin American socialists and the dictators, would so infuriate the Reagan-Bush administration that it would seek to assassinate him. I could not have known that on another dark night he would be killed during a routine flight in his twin otter, or that most of the world outside the United States would have no doubt that Torrijos' death at the age of 52 was just one more in a series of CIA assassinations. Had Torrijos lived, he undoubtedly would have sought to quell the growing violence that has plagued so many Central and South American nations. Based on his record, we can assume that he would have tried to work out an arrangement to mitigate international oil company destruction of the Amazon regions of Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. One result of such action would be the alleviation of the terrible conflicts that Washington refers to as terrorist and drug wars, but which Torrijos would have seen as actions taken by desperate people to protect their families and homes. Most importantly, I feel certain that he would have served as a role model for a new generation of leaders in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, something the CIA, the NSA, and the EHMs could not allow. Chapter 28. My Energy Company, Enron, and George W. Bush. At the time of Torrijos' death, I had not seen Paula for several months. I was dating other women, including Winifred Grant, a young environmental planner I had met at Maine, and whose father happened to be chief architect at Bechtel. Paula was dating a Colombian journalist. We remained friends, but agreed to sever our romantic ties. I struggled with my job as an expert witness, particularly in justifying the Seabrook nuclear power plant. It often seemed as though I had sold out again, slipping back into an old role simply for the sake of money. Winifred was an immense help to me during this period. She was an avowed environmentalist, yet she understood the practical necessities of providing ever-increasing amounts of electricity. She had grown up in the Berkeley area of San Francisco's East Bay and had graduated from UC Berkeley. She was a free thinker whose views on life contrasted with those of my puritanical parents and of Anne. Our relationship developed. Winifred took a leave of absence from Maine, and together we sailed my boat down the Atlantic coast toward Florida. We took our time, frequently leaving the boat in different ports so I could fly off to provide expert witness testimony. Eventually, we sailed into West Palm Beach, Florida, and rented an apartment. We married, and our daughter, Jessica, was born on May 17, 1982. I was 36, considerably older than all the other men who hung out in Lama's class. Part of my job on the Seabrook case was to convince the New Hampshire Public Service Commission that nuclear power was the best and most economical choice for generating electricity in the state. Unfortunately, the longer I studied the issue, the more I began to doubt the validity of my own arguments. The literature was constantly changing at that time, reflecting a growth in research, and the evidence increasingly indicated that many alternative forms of energy were technically superior and more economical than nuclear power. The balance also was beginning to shift away from the old theory that nuclear power was safe. Serious questions were being raised about the integrity of backup systems, the training of operators, the human tendency to make mistakes, equipment fatigue, and the inadequacy of nuclear waste disposal. I personally became uncomfortable with the position I was expected to take, was paid to take, under oath, in what amounted to a court of law. At the same time, I was becoming convinced that some of the emerging technologies offered electricity-generating methods that could actually help the environment. This was particularly true in the area of generating electricity from substances previously considered waste products. One day I informed my bosses at the New Hampshire Utility Company that I could no longer testify on their behalf. I gave up this very lucrative career and decided to create a company that would move some of the new technologies off the drawing boards and put the theories into practice. Winifred supported me 100%, despite the uncertainties of the venture and the fact that, for the first time in her life, she was now starting a family. Several months before Jessica's birth in 1982, I founded Independent Power Systems, IPS, a company whose mission included developing environmentally beneficial power plants and establishing models to inspire others to do likewise. It was a high-risk business, and most of our competitors eventually failed. However, coincidences came to our rescue. In fact, I was certain that many times someone stepped in to help, that I was being rewarded for my past service and for my commitment to silence. Bruno Zambati had accepted a high-level position at the Inter-American Development Bank. He agreed to serve on the IPS board and to help finance the fledgling company. We received backing from Bankers Trust, ESI Energy, Prudential Insurance Company, Chadbourne and Park, a major Wall Street law firm, in which former U.S. Senator, presidential candidate, and Secretary of State Ed Muskie was a partner, and Riley Stoker Corporation, an engineering firm owned by Ashland Oil Company, which designed and built highly sophisticated and innovative power plant boilers. We even had backing from the U.S. Congress, which singled out IPS for exemption from a specific tax, and in the process gave us a distinct advantage over our competitors. In 1986, IPS and Bechtel simultaneously, but independently of each other, began construction of power plants that used highly innovative, state-of-the-art technologies for burning waste coal without producing acid rain. By the end of the decade, these two plants had revolutionized the utility industry, directly contributing to new national anti-pollution laws by proving once and for all that many so-called waste products actually can be converted into electricity, and that coal can be burned without creating acid rain, thereby dispelling long-standing utility company claims to the contrary. Our plant also established that such unproven, state-of-the-art technologies could be financed by a small, independent company through Wall Street and other conventional means. As an added benefit, the IPS power plant sent vented heat to a 3.5-acre hydroponic greenhouse, rather than into cooling ponds or cooling towers. My role as IPS president gave me an inside track on the energy industry. I dealt with some of the most influential people in the business, lawyers, lobbyists, investment bankers, and high-level executives at the major firms. I also had the advantage of a father-in-law who had spent over 30 years at Bechtel, had risen to the position of chief architect, and now was in charge of building a city in Saudi Arabia, a direct result of the work I had done in the early 1970s during the Saudi Arabian money laundering affair. Winifred grew up near Bechtel's San Francisco world headquarters and was also a member of the corporate family. Her first job after graduating from UC Berkeley was at Bechtel. The energy industry was undergoing major restructuring. The big engineering firms were jockeying to take over, or at least to compete with, the utility companies that previously had enjoyed the privileges of local monopolies. Deregulation was the watchword of the day, and rules changed overnight. Opportunities abounded for ambitious people to take advantage of a situation that baffled the courts and Congress. Industry pundits dubbed it the Wild West of Energy era. One casualty of this process was Maine. As Bruno predicted, Mac Hall had lost touch with reality, and no one dared tell him so. Paul Priddy never asserted control, and Maine's management not only failed to take advantage of the changes sweeping the industry, but also made a series of fatal mistakes. Only a few years after Bruno delivered record profits, Maine dropped its EHM role and was in dire financial straits. The partners sold Maine to one of the large engineering and construction firms that had played its cards right. While I had received almost $30 a share for my stock in 1980, the remaining partners settled for less than half that amount, approximately 4 years later. Thus did 100 years of proud service end in humiliation. I was sad to see the company fold, but I felt vindicated that I had gotten out when I did. The Maine name continued under the new ownership for a while, but then it was dropped. The logo that had once carried such weight in countries around the globe fell into oblivion. Maine was one example of a company that did not cope well in the changing atmosphere of the energy industry. At the opposite end of the spectrum was a company we insiders found fascinating, Enron. One of the fastest-growing organizations in the business, it seemed to come out of nowhere and immediately began putting together mammoth deals. Most business meetings open with a few moments of idle chatter while the participants settle into their seats, pour themselves cups of coffee, and arrange their papers. In those days, the idle chatter often centered on Enron. No one outside the company could fathom how Enron was able to accomplish such miracles. Those on the inside simply smiled at the rest of us and kept quiet. Occasionally, when pressed, they talked about new approaches to management, about creative financing, and about their commitment to hiring executives who knew their way through the corridors of power in capitals across the globe. To me, this all sounded like a new version of old EHM techniques. The global empire was marching forward at a rapid pace. For those of us interested in oil and the international scene, there was another frequently discussed topic, the vice president's son, George W. Bush. His first energy company, Arbusto, Spanish for Bush, was a failure that ultimately was rescued through a 1984 merger with Spectrum 7. Then Spectrum 7 found itself poised at the brink of bankruptcy and was purchased in 1986 by Harkin Energy Corporation. G.W. Bush was retained as a board member and consultant, with an annual salary of $120,000. We all assumed that having a father who was the U.S. Vice President factored into this hiring decision, since the younger Bush's record of accomplishment as an oil executive certainly did not warrant it. It also seemed no coincidence that Harkin took this opportunity to branch out into the international field for the first time in its corporate history, and to begin actively searching for oil investments in the Middle East. Vanity Fair magazine reported, "Once Bush took his seat on the board, wonderful things started to happen to Harkin. New investments, unexpected sources of financing, serendipitous drilling rights." In 1989, Amoco was negotiating with the government of Bahrain for offshore drilling rights. Then Vice President Bush was elected president. Shortly thereafter, Michael Amin, a State Department consultant assigned to brief the newly confirmed U.S. ambassador to Bahrain, Charles Hostler, arranged for meetings between the Bahraini government and Harkin Energy. Suddenly, Amoco was replaced by Harkin. Although Harkin had not previously drilled outside the southeastern United States, and never offshore, it won exclusive drilling rights in Bahrain, something previously unheard of in the Arab world. Within a few weeks, the price of Harkin Energy stock increased by over 20%, from $4.50 to $5.50 per share. Even seasoned energy people were shocked by what had happened in Bahrain. "I hope G.W. isn't up to something his father will pay for," said a lawyer friend of mine who specialized in the energy industry and also was a major supporter of the Republican Party. We were enjoying cocktails at a bar around the corner from Wall Street, high atop the World Trade Center. He expressed dismay. "I wonder if it's really worth it," he continued, shaking his head sadly. "Is the son's career worth risking the presidency?" I was less surprised than my peers, but I suppose I had a unique perspective. I had worked for the governments of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iran. I was familiar with Middle Eastern politics, and I knew that Bush, just like the Enron executives, was part of the network I and my EHM colleagues had created. They were the feudal lords and plantation masters.